Alright, howdy folks, welcome back to Top Comics Pressing. In this video, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the difference between blue labels and purple labels. For those of you who might be new to the hobby, the universal blue label is what a quote normal unrestored comic book should get, and a purple label is what CGC gives a restored comic book. Now, sometimes you'll see the abbreviation PLOD or PLOD. That is short for Purple Label of Doom. And the reason for that is most blue label books have a set fair market value, and when a book has the dreaded purple label of doom, often its fair market value can drop by 50% or more. On some mega golden age keys, it can be like 70%. Okay, so just like an insane smash for being a restored copy. But for your average kind of Silver Age Marvel key issues, you're looking at somewhere between a 50 and a 60% fair market value reduction when something gets slammed with ye olde PLOD. Okay, and so because of that, one of these is highly sought after by collectors. The other one, some people consider cancer on their collection. I'm personally somewhere in between. I'm a pragmatic person and I view comic books as a fun hobby. I enjoy reading them. I enjoy the characters in them. I enjoy improving them to make them look great, and I can appreciate the art, the aesthetic, and the creators. I've got a wall up here that I have some of my favorites in. Some comic books I love because of the depth of the stories and the characters. Some are just goofy, dopey, laugh out loud, silly. That's awesome too. Sometimes you just need a healthy dose of Hulk smash in your diet too, and I can appreciate that. Okay. We also love the movies. We love the cartoons. We love the action figure. Well, I'm not much of an action figure collector anymore, but man, as a kid, did I ever just play with action figures for hours? All right, you probably did too. Doesn't really matter. All right, so back to the conversation at hand. I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the kinds of restoration that'll make you go from blue label to purple label, and also talk about how that kind of intersects with stain removal and whitening and where the cover cleaned denotion comes from. All right, the reason, at least I think initially, why CGC would have made this purple label distinction is because it was quite common in the 70s or 80s, and even, up until modern. I've had some modern books that have had restoration on them, which is quite frustrating. But the reason people would restore a book is to kind of artificially make it look better than it was. And then because value is associated with the grade, in principle, a dealer could do something underhanded and then sell you a book which might not be as high quality as it looks on the surface. And so because of that, I think it's fair to have a different designation and talk about what those things can be. So let's just rattle off some of the most common kinds of restoration, one of which would be color touch. So that would be using some kind of paint, marker, dye, you name it, to fill in some part of a comic book that was damaged and had a white line. One of the most common places for that is along the spine, where you have spine stress lines and you have all those light ticks. Well, if it's a black cover and you got a black Sharpie, you just kind of right down the line. That would obviously bleed through, and it would be kind of the most amateur restoration CGC would nail. But I've found copies of the Amazing Spider-Man 300 that have had Sharpie ticked on the top and the bottom corner to cover up a binary tear. I've seen more modern books that might have had a gouge or something out of the side, and somebody's painted that in with some black. So color touch is adding some pigment to the comic book which was not already there to hide or disguise damage that had occurred since it was manufactured. One of the other ones is a tear seal, and most commonly a tear seal is just somebody taking a thumbprint full of glue and gluing it down the cover. Now, tear seals by themselves sometimes can be glue on the interior, sometimes they can be glue on the exterior, sometimes they can be fancier adhesives, sometimes it is actually gluing the comic book to the cover, and then that is a little bit more problematic because you actually can't see the splash page then because it's been glued shut. But from arm's length, or if you're just quickly opening it up to see how many pages there are, you might miss a tear that was there because it's been glued shut and it doesn't obviously flop out, right? So if you got a 6-inch tear on the back and you pull the comic book out and you can see the pages kind of flop apart, it's pretty obvious. And so by gluing it shut, it might disguise it short term, or you might be able to, get it past somebody that it had not really had a tear. You can also have spine splits sealed, and so for those of you that have worked with old books, you know, especially because that's where they've been folded, sometimes right along the spine, they just pop open, and so that's you know, a very common place for it. You can have yeah, and so you can seal the spine a number of different ways. Sometimes it's glue, sometimes it's other paper fiber, you know. And then you can have staples replaced or cleaned. So if you have rusty staples and you physically take them out, submerge them in a chemical bath to, you know, rust remover them, just like you might do with a car part or some other tool where you actually, you know, remove the rust, usually in an acidic solution. Then you can rinse that off and then put it back in the comic book. You know, that's very clearly disguising that damage, and you might have a staple that should have some like tarnish to it or maybe some extensive rust, and all of a sudden it's looking shiny, even though the comic book is, you know, 60 years old or something like that. You can have piece fill, and piece fill is some artificial piece of paper that wasn't originally part of the comic book, which gets added to the comic book to try to disguise it. You know, in its crudest sense, that would be somebody just like taking copy paper where you've got a chunk out of a cover and they just kind of glue copy paper to the back of it. And then usually piece fill is associated with color touch too, because if I got a comic book with a chunk out of it, I can glue new paper to it, and then I just paint what should be there, and now I have piece fill with color touch, and it looks pretty obvious. So I've got a bunch of videos, by the way, in the channel about detecting color touch, as well as looking at probably the most extensively restored comic book I've held in a while was the first Brainiac issue. So Action Comics 210 maybe? Don't quote me on that, but there's a video on that. So another one is to trim stuff. So a modern comic book is a smaller physical dimensions than Golden Age books, and Silver Age or somewhere in between. And depending on exactly which Golden Age publisher, you'll have slightly different dimensions. And the truth is, if you take a whole handful of 70s Marvels and stack them up on the sides, you're gonna have some natural variation in the tops anyway. But you know, there was a lot of damage on the sides, especially, you know, Marvel chipping. So if you go look at that, where they were trying to cut the comics with blades that should have been changed 1,000 issues ago, but they were too broke to do that, so instead they just would reel damaged comics off the line. So you end up with this characteristic damage on the open edge of a lot of Marvel comic books, which is called Marvel chipping. And, you know, people don't like that. And so it was easier maybe to, after the book was sold 10, 15 years later, line it up with a huge paper cutter and just chop that part of the book off. Especially when the size of the comic book shrank anyway, you could hide it to somebody that didn't know it should have been bigger. And so that is kind of comic book trimming. Now, some comic book trimming wasn't done for aesthetic appeal, you know, especially before we had trade paperbacks and omnibuses. If you go all the way back to the 50s and 60s, people might take their stack of comic books and bring them to a professional bookbinder who might thread them into a hard bound edition and then even the edges off by trimming all of the edges of the comic book. So that is still trimming. It will still be labeled as restoration by CGC or CBCS, but it wasn't really done for the aesthetic value or an attempt at increasing the aesthetic value of the comic book. It was done to make the book fit together and make it look all nice on a shelf. So those are kind of going to be some of the most common forms. And then, of course, cover cleaning for whatever that's worth. Now, I want to take a second here to point out how that might vary from a modern comic book cleaning and pressing. So in principle, taking a book that is filthy and rubbing my eraser on it ad nauseum is not considered cleaning in any way or restoration by CGC or CBCS. And I think if you asked, at least when I explain to people what my hobby is, they say, oh, you restore comic books. And I have to be like, well, sort of. In the colloquial, yes. In the technical, no. Technically, CGC will not view that as restoration. But if I take a picture of a completely filthy 60s comic book with a white cover that is, and then I beautify it by removing decades worth of gunk with my eraser, I think most people would call that a cleaned cover, and they would say I've restored the comic book, right? Especially if I have a comic book that has a full crunch where every individual page on that corner is scrunched together, and I diligently iron them all out and then press the thing so it's flat, or if I hide the fact that there was moisture damage there because the whole book had a crinkle to it, and I slowly humidify and iron every single page and then put that in the press. I think most people would consider that restoration, but of course it's not today in terms of the technical meaning of restoration for CGC or CBCS or a comic book grading company. Okay, so why do I bring this up? I think we as collectors have kind of a twisted perspective as to what we're okay accepting versus what all of a sudden we call collection cancer. Or at least that's how purple labels have been described to me before. I think the distinction between these sometimes might merit a 50 or 60% price reduction in fair market value, but I think often it does not, at least from my point of view. And I'm kind of twisted in perspective because I spend a good amount of my time doing the okay restoration, where I dry clean comic books, where I iron comic books, where I press comic books, and I get away with a good amount of covered cleaning, which is technically restoration, but it largely goes undetected, and so I can squeeze by with blue labels more often than not. At least as of the recording this, I was not tagged in 2023 for a purple cover cleaned. All right. The reason I bring that up is some of this is semantics, and it comes down to really how Matt Nelson defined it in the CGC comic grading book when somebody asked him how he invented these labels, right? So this whole idea of labeling comic books really does not go back that far. So early 2000s, 2002, 2003, I think, and I don't know when CGC introduced the purple label. It's probably in this book, but in there are a lot of things that I think are kind of silly. And so let me give you a couple of examples of that. If I take water and I introduce an old comic book with humidity as part of my pressing procedure, and I put that comic book in my press, that is not restoration. Okay, I've exposed that comic book to water, and I've taken the water back out, and it's not restoration. Okay, it's humidifying, it's part of a press, totally kosher. If I take water and I expose a comic book to it, but the water exposure happened in the 1980s and it left some gross marks on it, and then the paper deteriorated a little bit, that's damage caused by water, but it's definitely not restoration. If I take the cover off and submerge it into water to remove tanning, that is technically restoration. So I just want to point out kind of some mental gymnastics we have to do here. Water for the purposes of humidity for a comic book press, okay. Water because we left it under the sink or decided to read it in the shower or threw it in the car and left the window open in the thunderstorm, damage. Water for the purposes of removing stains, restoration. And so I think there's some, I don't know what you want to call it, but to me at least that seems weird. I'll give you another one that I think seems weird, and that is tape. Because it was so common back in the day, CGC has decided that introducing tape, vintage or new, regular old Scotch, masking, duct tape, electrical tape, or acid-free archival tape. That's what I use when I have to reattach a piece. It's called mending tape. It's an acid-free archival document tape. Usually very, very little piece of it. Doesn't matter if it was Scotch tape from the 50s or if it's archival tape from 2023. Neither of those count as restoration. They count as damage. I'm okay with that. That's fine if you want to view the object as though there weren't tape there. Assume that whatever the tape is there is damage, and then apply extra damage for there being tape. I think that that's okay. But what's weird about that is tape is kosher. That's all right. But glue of any kind, hot glue, super glue, Elmer's glue, glue of any kind is restoration. Okay. So the reason I point that out is it's kind of weird that if you take your fingers full of Elmer's and glue down the spine to keep it together, you've restored it. If you take that same spine and take a big chunk of tape and tape it, damage. Okay. So same book, you're applying an adhesive to both. The underlying chemicals between tape and glue are quite similar. The difference, though, is we've decided tape is okay and glue is a problem. Okay. Pen and ink is another one. So it was very, very common back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to have arrival date stamps either in grease pen on the cover. If you had somebody would write their name across them. So I have a number of Golden Age books that have somebody's name across the top of them. Some people would just put their initials or maybe have a price. That's okay on the back as long as it's not obtrusive. CGC views writing on the cover, whether it be pencil, ink, marker, or grease pen, to all be fine. Sometimes there's a very minor grade ding for light names from back in the day. By the way, if that name happens to be an illustrator and CGC did not witness it, then it's a green label, which adds an extra nuance to all of this. But that old vintage name, the old arrival date stamp, the grease pen mark, a actual physical date stamp, that was all okay. That's viewed as very minor damage. But if that ink, the same material, is along the spine, then you have restoration. Okay, and that is color touch. Same materials have been added. Two very different outcomes. Now, I understand that the intent of adding those materials is very different. Somebody writing their name carefully across the top is their way to stake their claim to the book. A store writing a grease pen arrival date is their way of taking care of inventory. And a dealer covering spine ticks on the spine is a nefarious way to try to disguise the damage from you, so you'll buy their product at a higher price than you would otherwise. That still leads to some weirdness, particularly with just kind of how you think about it. So, also if you just tape over those tear seals, it's just damage. You can reattach a piece with tape, it's just damage. You do it with a little bit of glue and it's a purple label resto. Okay. What's weird about this also is when you roll in now what CGC calls conservation. So if you read their book and if you look at these, there's a number of YouTube channels that do what's called leaf casting. Leaf casting in general is pretty cool. So if you have a truly brittle Golden Age comic book that's been shattered into 1,000 pieces and you want somebody to put that thing back together to try to keep it with humanity instead of in the dumpster, leaf casting is a pretty cool technique, but it involves weaving entirely new paper fibers onto a comic book. And that is viewed as conservation. And I understand the logic there, that the conservation is there to protect further deterioration of the comic book, whereas restoration is there to artificially increase the aesthetics of the comic book that's there, and either serves no conserving purpose or actually may lead to further deterioration, depending on what materials are used and what age it was. So I can understand that logical difference between trying to make sure a comic book does not further deteriorate versus trying to take a comic book and just make it look better so you can sell it for more. I get that. I just think if you asked, 99 out of 100 people on the street, is it more or less restoration to take a comic book and hit it with some black Sharpie and color touch, or to completely weave new paper fiber into it after pulling the cover off and lining it all up? It's a very cool technique. I'm not knocking it. I actually think it's really neat. It's not something I do. I don't have the patience or the skill set for it. But, I think if you ask most people, is that restoration versus shining some blue light on a comic book, they would say absolutely. Or running some glue down a comic book. I think that they would just be viewed inherently as more restorative than adding some Elmer's glue across the tear. So it's just kind of some juxtaposition and mental gymnastics you have to do. Again, if you're new to the hobby, take some time to figure out what the difference is. In my personal collection, I'm okay with some purple labels. And particularly the reason for that is, obviously there's a huge difference in fair market value, which makes these a lot more affordable. But also, after I've opened up and held comic books that are technically restored by CGC, no boogeymen pop out of them at me. Okay, so that Action Comics with the first Brainiac that I have the other video of, I'll drop the link down here below. That's a hard to find issue. The thing looks great from arm's length. All of the guts are there. The whole comic book was complete. The pages looked fine. You're still getting something that is a piece of comic book history. One of the comic books I meant to bring up here for this video that I didn't is I have a trimmed Golden Age Batman key. It was part of a bound collection, right? So I can tell I've got the thread holes down the spine and all three edges are fairly trimmed. If I hold that thing up to one of my other Golden Age Batman books, it's smaller on at least 3 sides. Okay, so it's definitely been trimmed. But I'm cool with it. I mean, to me, that book, having gone from somebody's hands at a newsstand into a bound collection that they probably enjoyed as an adult and then was later separated probably as they passed away, and somebody decided like, holy cow, there's a, you know, golden age Batman books in here. We separate these out, get them certified, encapsulated, and then sold as part of a collection. To me, that's just part of the history of that comic book. And I don't really see that as being, you know, inherently cancerous to my collection. Other books I have that have been restored might just have a little bit of color touch. So I have an Iron Man 55 First Thanos. That one has some color touch. I got it for pittance. It was like laughably cheap because somebody had scribbled in the creases. I was thinking about doing color touch removal, but there's probably about 12 total inches of crease that would have to be cleaned out, and then another patch that is, you know, maybe the quarter of a penny or something like that. It looked pretty awful, basically, by the time I scratched out all the color touch. I'm just going to leave it. It looks fine from here, you know, as you look into it. So, you know, to me, I understand why there is this distinction. I guess what I find hard to understand is why it's so gigantic of a distinction. And also, you know, I think a lot of the stigma could be dealt with differently if we just called it all damage, right? So if you had a spine that was taped, you know, we still view that as a split spine, and then you add extra damage onto it for having the tape. You know, if it's glue, you could just do the same thing and say this whole spine is split and somebody added glue to it, so we're going to knock the grade down further, and I think that would cover it. You know, I think if color touch just came with a massive grade ding associated with it without a different colored label, it would probably affect the same overall issue to the community, which is don't color touch your books because the value is going to go down. And I think that would get you to the same spot overall if you viewed, you know, a book with color touch as having creases wherever that color touch is and having damage from paint on it, right? And you could make paint a special category of ink that really knocked the grade down further. And so I think that that would, you know, take care of it and maybe help a wider variety of people enjoy books. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents, but, you know, since restoration has come up in the context of cover cleaning as well as color touch, and, you know, I've seen auction results so all over the place. I had that one example of somebody's ASM 129 being labeled as trimmed, only to get resubmitted and the trimmed went away. You know, that book was going to sell for half or less with that trimmed connotation on it. And that's really kind of crazy, especially because it wasn't trimmed. So yeah. All right, that's my 2 cents. Go ahead and drop some comments down below. Leave me a thumbs up and click that subscribe button. It's right here. It's right there. Maybe it's right there. Go ahead and click the subscribe. All right, and keep on watching. Keep on collecting what you like. If that includes the occasional restored comic book, I'm all right with it. If you are a Blue Label purist, feel free to write that down as well. But anyway, take care and keep on collecting what you enjoy.